Picture this. You're sitting in the Colosseum in 80 AD, and you witness a man dressed as Orpheus being torn apart by wild bears while playing a lyre. His fingers still pluck the strings as claws tear through his flesh, the haunting melody mixing with his screams, while 50,000 spectators roar with delight. The crowd throws flower petals down onto his mutilated corpse as if celebrating a victory. But this isn't just entertainment. This is a twisted execution disguised as mythology, where reality and nightmare become indistinguishable. What I'm about to tell you about Roman arena spectacles will make modern horror movies look like children's cartoons, because the Romans didn't just imagine the unthinkable, they made it happen again and again for over 6 centuries. If you think you know how brutal ancient Rome was, think again. Like this video if you're ready to discover the most disturbing arena spectacles that went so far beyond entertainment that they shocked even the Romans themselves. And tell me in the comments, how far is too far for entertainment? In 264 BC, what started as a simple funeral ritual changed the course of human entertainment forever. 3 pairs of slaves fought to the death at a Roman funeral, and the crowd's bloodthirsty reaction birthed an industry of death that would consume the empire for over 600 years. But here's what most people don't realize. Those first gladiatorial games were actually a religious ceremony meant to honor the dead by sending blood into the earth. The Romans believed that human blood had magical properties that could appease the spirits of their ancestors. What began as honoring the dead became a tool of imperial madness, political control, and unimaginable cruelty that pushed the boundaries of human depravity. By the 1st century AD, these games had evolved into something that would have horrified their original creators. Massive industrial-scale killing machines designed not just to execute criminals, but to do so in the most psychologically devastating and creatively brutal ways possible. The Romans had accidentally created a monster that would eventually devour their own civilization. The Romans didn't just want blood, they wanted spectacle, drama, and innovation in death. By the time of the emperors, these games had transformed into something far more sinister than simple gladiatorial combat. The arena had become a theater of the impossible, where the laws of nature, human dignity, and basic morality were suspended for the entertainment of the masses. Emperors like Caligula turned the arena into their personal playground of psychological torture, where reality blended with nightmare in ways that defied comprehension. But Caligula wasn't content with just watching death. He wanted to direct it, choreograph it, and make it into high art. He would spend months planning single executions, working with architects, engineers, and artists to create elaborate death scenarios that would leave audiences speechless. Can you imagine watching condemned prisoners forced to reenact deadly myths where the ending was always real death? Picture a man playing Icarus with real wings strapped to his back, thrown from a tower only to crash and die on the arena floor while 50,000 spectators cheered. But the Romans didn't stop there. They would sometimes have multiple Icarus prisoners, throwing them one by one until the arena floor was littered with broken bodies and feathers soaked in blood. The theatrical executions became increasingly elaborate and sadistic. Prisoners playing Prometheus would be chained to rocks and have their livers eaten by live eagles. But unlike the myth, there was no regeneration, just slow, agonizing death as the birds tore through their abdomens. Others were forced to play Sisyphus, but instead of pushing a boulder up a hill for eternity, they were crushed beneath a stone when they inevitably collapsed from exhaustion. But the theatrical executions were just the beginning. Emperors became obsessed with creating new forms of spectacular death, turning the arena into a laboratory of human suffering where creativity was measured in screams and innovation was calculated in blood. They established entire departments dedicated to developing new execution methods, employing the empire's best engineers and artists to design increasingly elaborate killing machines. Nero took arena madness to unprecedented levels that shocked even Rome's desensitized population. Historical records describe him forcing prisoners to reenact the myth of Daedalus, but instead of escaping, these doomed souls were fitted with wax wings and pushed from great heights, their bodies shattering on impact, while Nero applauded from his imperial box, sometimes conducting the screams like a twisted symphony. But Nero wasn't satisfied with just theatrical murders. He wanted to be remembered as the most creative killer in human history. He introduced rigged combat where gladiators were given deliberately faulty weapons, swords that bend on impact, armor designed to tear apart at the first strike, shields made of papyrus instead of wood that dissolved when blood hit them. Imagine being a gladiator, thinking you're fighting for your life with real equipment, only to discover your sword crumbles at the first clash while your opponent's blade finds its mark. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical death, because these fighters realized in their final moments that they had never had a chance. Nero also pioneered the use of wild animals as execution assistants in ways that defied belief. He would have prisoners dressed as mythological characters and then release animals trained specifically for their roles. Men playing Actaeon would be torn apart by specially trained hunting dogs, while women playing Europa would be trampled and gored by bulls. The animals themselves were often tortured and starved beforehand to ensure maximum savagery. Then came Commodus, who believed he was Hercules reborn and took personal participation to psychotic extremes. This deranged emperor didn't just watch, he participated, but in the most cowardly and sadistic way possible. He would fight crippled gladiators, animals with their claws removed and teeth pulled, and prisoners chained to posts who couldn't defend themselves. Historical accounts describe him decapitating ostriches with specially designed arrows, and then holding up the severed heads while staring menacingly at senators, silently threatening them with the same fate. But Commodus's most disturbing innovation was his divine gladiator performances, where he would fight in elaborate costumes representing different gods, always against hopelessly outmatched opponents. He killed over 1,000 gladiators in rigged combat, each death designed to reinforce his delusion of godhood. Spectators were forced to worship him as he stood over the corpses, and anyone who showed insufficient enthusiasm was marked for execution. Caligula, meanwhile, had developed an obsession with making the impossible happen in the arena. He created elaborate mechanical devices that could make it appear as if the dead were coming back to life, only to kill them again in new ways. He would have criminals executed, then use hidden mechanisms to make their corpses appear to move, speak, or even fight, before having them torn apart by wild animals. The psychological impact on the audience was devastating. Many spectators left these performances permanently traumatized, unable to distinguish between reality and nightmare. But perhaps nothing exemplified Roman excess like the Nomachi, massive artificial naval battles that turned the arena into an ocean of death, where the Romans proved they could make even drowning into a spectacle. Emperors flooded enormous basins with water, filled them with condemned prisoners on ships, and forced them to fight to the death while slowly drowning. Augustus staged a naumachia with 3,000 combatants in a specially constructed artificial lake. Historical records suggest that fewer than 50 survived the day. Picture this nightmare. You're a captured enemy soldier, chained to an oar in a sinking ship, water rising around your ankles while arrows fly overhead and sword-wielding enemies leap aboard. The crowd above roars as your ship lists and water pours through the hull. But you can't swim because of the chains. There's no escape, no mercy. Only the choice between drowning, burning alive as flaming arrows set your ship ablaze, or dying by the sword as enemy combatants hack their way through your crewmates. These weren't battles. They were elaborate drowning ceremonies disguised as entertainment, designed to maximize suffering while providing the most spectacular deaths possible. The Romans would deliberately sabotage ships to ensure they would sink at the most dramatic moments. They would use specially trained divers to pull drowning combatants underwater just as they were about to reach safety. They would release sharks and other predatory fish into the water to attack the swimming survivors. Claudius staged a naumachia on Lake Fucinus with 19,000 condemned prisoners representing the fleets of Rhodes and Sicily. The emperor sat on a golden throne wearing the costume of Neptune, while presiding over this industrial-scale drowning. Historical records suggest that only a few hundred survived, and those were likely executed afterward for the crowd's amusement because the spectators had become so bloodthirsty that they refused to let anyone escape alive. The logistics of these naval battles were staggering. Entire forests were cut down to build the ships that would be destroyed in a single afternoon. Thousands of workers spent months constructing elaborate lake systems, complete with artificial islands, underwater traps, and mechanical sea monsters that would emerge from the depths to drag down swimmers. The cost was so enormous that staging a single naumachia could bankrupt entire provinces. But emperors continued to compete over who could stage the most elaborate aquatic massacre. Domitian took the naumachi to their ultimate extreme by staging battles during thunderstorms, believing that the combination of drowning, combat, and lightning strikes would create the most spectacular deaths ever witnessed. The psychological impact on participants was devastating. Many prisoners went insane from terror before the battles even began, having to be dragged to their ships in chains while screaming prayers to gods who would never answer. The animal hunts pushed Roman cruelty into environmental catastrophe on a scale that seems almost impossible to comprehend. During the inauguration of the Colosseum alone, they slaughtered 9,000 exotic animals in 100 days. But that was just the beginning. Over the next 4 centuries, the Romans would systematically hunt entire species to extinction, purely for the sake of a few hours of entertainment. But these weren't fair hunts. They were carefully orchestrated torture sessions designed to maximize both animal suffering and human terror. Animals were often starved for days before being released, making them desperate and vicious. Others were tortured with red-hot irons, had their claws and teeth partially removed to prolong fights, or were drugged with substances that made them incredibly aggressive but clumsy, ensuring spectacular but drawn-out deaths. Prisoners condemned to the beast faced deaths so horrific that many committed suicide rather than face the arena. They would be tied to stakes and mauled to death by bears that had been trained to kill slowly, keeping victims alive as long as possible, while tearing off limbs piece by piece. Others were sewn into animal skins and thrown to wild dogs that would attack them, thinking they were hunting their natural prey. The dogs would tear through the hide to reach human flesh, often spending hours slowly eating their victims alive. The Romans created elaborate mechanical devices called pegamata, complex elevator systems that could lift animals from underground chambers directly into the arena through trapdoors, ensuring a constant supply of fresh terror for both beasts and victims. These machines were so sophisticated that they could coordinate the simultaneous release of dozens of different animals, creating chaos scenarios where prisoners never knew what horror would emerge next. The ecological impact was absolutely devastating and unprecedented in human history. Entire species disappeared from their native habitats, hunted to near extinction to satisfy Roman bloodlust. North African elephants, once numbering in the hundreds of thousands, were reduced to tiny populations hiding in remote mountains. Mesopotamian lions, Syrian bears, Atlas mountain bears, and countless other species were driven to extinction or near extinction purely for arena entertainment. Roman hunting expeditions reached across the known world, penetrating deep into Africa, Asia, and northern Europe to capture increasingly exotic animals. They built specialized ships designed solely for transporting wild animals, complete with reinforced cages, feeding systems, and medical facilities to keep the animals alive long enough to die in the arena. The logistics network required to supply the empire's appetite for exotic death was staggering. Entire armies of hunters, trappers, trainers, and transporters whose only job was ensuring a steady supply of animals to kill for entertainment. But the Romans didn't just want to see animals killed. They wanted to see them killed in creative and unusual ways. They would force elephants to fight rhinoceroses, lions to battle tigers, and bears to combat bulls, creating unnatural conflicts that resulted in prolonged suffering for all involved. They developed specialized weapons and traps designed to wound but not immediately kill animals, ensuring extended death scenes that could last for hours while the crowd cheered every roar of pain. The psychological impact on the animals was as deliberately cruel as the physical torture. Many animals arrived in Rome already traumatized from months of transport in cramped, dark cages. They would be kept in underground chambers beneath the arena for weeks before their deaths, listening to the sounds of combat and slaughter above, slowly going insane from terror and confinement. By the time they were released into the arena, Many were so psychologically broken that they would simply lie down and wait to be killed rather than fight back. Roman depravity knew no gender boundaries. Female gladiators, called gladiatrices, were forced into the arena not just to fight each other, but to be humiliated, tortured, and killed in ways specifically designed to degrade women. They fought naked or nearly naked, often against wild animals or in rigged combat scenarios where death was inevitable. Some were forced to wear armor that was deliberately designed to fail, breastplates that shattered at the first blow, helmets that blocked their vision, or weapons so heavy they couldn't lift them effectively. The crowd's entertainment came not from skill or bravery, but from watching women suffer and die in the most degrading ways possible. Emperors introduced increasingly bizarre and cruel weapons and armor. Gladiators were forced to fight with fishing nets against tridents, or with their left hands chained to their right feet. Some were given wooden swords against fully armed opponents, or forced to fight blindfolded while their opponents could see perfectly. The creativity in designing unfair and torturous combat scenarios seemed limitless. Not all Romans accepted this madness. Philosophers like Seneca wrote scathingly about the arena's brutality, describing how it corrupted the human soul and turned citizens into bloodthirsty monsters. Early Christians refused to attend, viewing the games as fundamentally evil and incompatible with human dignity. Marcus Aurelius tried to humanize the games by requiring gladiators to fight with blunted weapons, but the crowd's disappointment at seeing less blood forced him to reverse many of these reforms. The Roman people had become addicted to death, and any emperor who tried to limit their supply risked political suicide. Tacitus wrote that the games had transformed Roman citizens into creatures who could only feel excitement when watching other humans suffer and die. The philosopher Plutarch argued that the arena was turning the empire into a nation of psychopaths, desensitized to human pain and incapable of empathy. As the empire expanded, so did the scale of arena spectacles. Provincial governors competed to stage the most elaborate and deadly games, creating a culture where political success was measured by how creatively you could orchestrate mass death. Cities across the empire built amphitheaters, spreading this culture of cruelty from Britain to Egypt. The economic cost was staggering. Entire treasuries were emptied to pay for increasingly elaborate spectacles. The logistics of capturing, transporting, and maintaining thousands of gladiators, exotic animals, and condemned prisoners created a massive industry built entirely on human suffering. Ships sailed across the Mediterranean carrying nothing but doomed cargo destined for arena slaughter. The psychological impact on Roman society was profound. Children grew up watching humans torn apart for fun. Citizens measured their social status by how close they could sit to the carnage. The games had created a civilization where the capacity for empathy was systematically destroyed, where normal human reactions to suffering were trained out of entire populations. The arena spectacles didn't just reflect Roman brutality, they accelerated the empire's moral and political collapse. A civilization that could watch children torn apart by wild animals while eating lunch had lost something essential about what it meant to be human. The games consumed enormous resources, distracted from real problems, and created a population dependent on increasingly extreme stimulation to feel alive. By the 4th century, even some emperors began to recognize that the games had gone too far. Constantine, influenced by Christianity, began limiting the most brutal spectacles, though gladiatorial combat continued for decades more. The last recorded gladiatorial games took place in 435 AD, but by then, the damage to Roman civilization was irreversible. The Western Empire fell just 41 years later. Historians debate many causes, but few deny that a society capable of such systematic dehumanization had lost the moral foundation necessary to sustain a great civilization. The Roman arena spectacles represent humanity's capacity for both incredible creativity and unimaginable cruelty. They show us how entertainment can become a drug, how the pursuit of novelty can lead to the abandonment of basic human decency, and how societies can normalize the most extreme brutality when it's packaged as culture and tradition. Perhaps most disturbing is how easily ordinary Roman citizens, people who loved their families, worked honest jobs, and considered themselves civilized, could sit in those stone seats and cheer as human beings were torn apart, drowned, burned alive, and tortured to death for their amusement. The arena spectacles weren't imposed by a tyrannical government on an unwilling population. They were demanded by the people themselves. What does this tell us about human nature? About the thin line between civilization and barbarism? About our own capacity for cruelty when it's sanctioned by society and packaged as entertainment? The Romans thought they were the pinnacle of human civilization, yet they created spectacles that would horrify even the most hardened modern audiences. The next time you watch something violent for entertainment, remember the Roman crowds cheering as Orpheus was torn apart by bears, as prisoners drowned in artificial naval battles, as exotic animals went extinct for the sake of a few hours of bloodshed. Remember how a great civilization lost its soul in pursuit of ever greater spectacle, and ask yourself, how far is too far?